Hi, this is Jeff Blauwet, Technical Agronomist for Cooperative Farmers Elevator, and back for another season of Field Friday. And you can see obviously we're not in the field today, but there's nothing going on in the field to really point out or talk about, and it's warmer in here. But kind of thought we'd start out the season here talking about we're here in the early part of April here. Starting to look towards that decision of should we or should we not plant corn, and what are some of the decisions that we need to make, and what would be the ramifications of those. And I thought we'd talk about a couple of those things. Obviously we're looking at here probably going to see some snow this weekend. Not exactly a great Easter Sunday for multiple reasons, and one of which is the weather, but the advanced forecast for next week doesn't look great either. Hopefully you don't have any crop in the ground. If it is, hopefully it's small grain, but anything that is in the ground besides that, I'd be a little worried about at this point. But probably isn't very many acres, if any, that are in the ground of corn or soybeans yet. So the decision is what and when should we start. Some of the key factors we always talk about, that 50-degree soil temperature and warming. I mean, that's ideal, of course. If we don't have that, so what happens? So it's not like there's a magic switch that once we hit 50 degrees in the soil temp that corn springs to life and starts growing. Obviously it's not much difference between 47, 48, 49 degrees and 50. But as we start to get in that warmer soil temps and 50 and above, you start to see that growth increase at a more rapid pace. That seedling doesn't sit in the ground for 3 weeks or a month like we've seen in the past. In the wrong weather conditions. So those are why those things are important. We have some great fungicides on all seed. In today's day and age, the genetics have a lot better emergence and vigor than they probably did 15, 20 years ago, but they're still not bulletproof. And if we know anything about what we've learned from some of these high yield situations when we've had the best success, it's ideal to have every corn plant emerge within 24 hours of each other. And for that to happen, we need to have fairly rapid growth, fairly rapid metabolism of some of the energy in that corn kernel, and a good seedling environment where it can emerge quickly. As we start getting 2, 3, 4 days of spread out emergence, we're not going to have the best yield potential, and nothing you can do from there fixes that. So doing it right the first time and giving yourself the best chance at the top end yield is pretty important. Especially with today's economic environment. There's two numbers that come into the equation, your price per bushel and the amount of bushels. We can only control one of those, so we better do our best to do that. But so if we think about what the forecast looks like, snow this weekend on Easter Sunday probably, and then really cold early next week. If I look at the advanced forecast beyond that, a gradual warm up, maybe by the end of next week, maybe we'll have conditions. If the forecast after that looks pretty good, maybe we can consider starting to roll here. We're putting a little bit of nitrogen on today. I expect next week, once we get this snow melted and start getting this stuff dried out, get warmer towards the end of next week, I think if the forecast beyond that looks good, we'll go and probably feel pretty good about it. So the seedling diseases, having a chance to impact that corn seedling if it sits in the ground for a long time is one of the things that'll help, or hurt, I guess I should say, emergence speed and the consistency. So those are some things we need to consider. But if we think about something that's been fairly common in the press, and we've even done some trials on it last year, we'll continue to do it, but if we get into next week and the weather looks okay but not great beyond that, we may want to consider trying some beans early. As few as 3 years ago, I would have said you're nuts for even considering that. But there's been a fair amount of research done in the industry, and we did some last year with some really poor conditions, and it worked out just fine, showing us how forgiving beans are. Even at very low planting populations and 70% germination or emergence of those, we still had tremendous yields. And beans are more forgiving. If we get a thinner stand, they can compensate much better than corn can. If the emergence isn't equal and even, that's not nearly as detrimental to soybeans as it is corn. So if we think about those situations, I know we've got some guys that are going to do that already this year, but maybe consider if it's iffy, consider putting some beans in. We're putting fungicide on the seed generally. Beans can deal with a lot of stress. Yep, there is a little bit more risk of beans freezing if we get into the last week of April or early May and we get some frost. Yep, beans growing point is above the ground once they emerge. It is true. Although their tissue is much more succulent, it takes a lower temperature for a longer time to actually freeze it off. But with every risk, there's a reward. I think there's enough guys that want to get going when they can, and I think if we can get some acres out of the way and feel better about it, I'd feel better about beans in marginal conditions, to be honest. So just some things to think about. We'll know more in a week from now what the forecast and what things look like. Hopefully we're rolling and we don't have time to do any more videos for a while. This probably won't be a weekly edition yet. Once we start getting busy, you're going to be busy, and that'll be, we'll get going again more on a weekly pattern once that happens. But just thought I'd throw this out there, kind of give you guys something to think about as we go forward into this, latter half of April. Hopefully we're rolling again and can get some stuff planted and not have to finish up in June like the last few years. So with that, that's this week's Field Friday segment, and maybe we'll see you next week.